PA Brian Watts here. We're privileged to be in Papua New Guinea from 1956 to 1971 and to see the birth of a church at Mism, which is good. And since then it's gone on and reached out from many other areas as well and has planted other churches. It's been a real privilege. When I first thought about missions, I had a few doubts because when I was brought up in the 60s, I thought, well, missionaries are fairly eloquent people, and I'm not very good at speaking. And also, the churches we were at was a mixed bag, really. We were living in a state advanced government housing area, which is about 50% of the area. 25% of the area was Maori housing, and 25% of the area was very, very rich people, and some of the most expensive houses in New Zealand. And from those rich people, several folk went out to different mission fields, one couple to Ethiopia and a couple to Papua New Guinea. But they were from families that were very well off and the children had been very well educated. We weren't well off and weren't very well educated. And when I went to BTI in 1954-55, Frank England just came over from England to be a senior lecturer, and I went out to his house at Point Chevalier to help him do a few little things on the house and a few alterations. And one day he looked at me and said, "Oh, it's amazing how you can look at a house and see what improvements can be made to it." And I said to him, "Well, it's amazing how you can look at a passenger in Scripture and make an excellent sermon from it." And he said, "Oh, we've both got different gifts." And I felt sitting under a tree, coconut palm, and preaching was not my gift, but God had other gifts for me to do as far as the building work goes. During our time in New Guinea, we did a variety of building work and school teaching, medical work, a lot of medical work. And we used to have a church service in the morning, and in the after the church service, we opened a big medicine cupboard at the back of the church and attended to tropical ulcers, and some had been gored by pigs, some had knife cuts. And I realised then Christianity is not just about a lot of preaching and a lot of words. You've got to show the love of Christ to them and practical ways of helping them. And quite often your actions speak so loud that people can't hear what you actually say. In the 1960s, I was asked to do the work of building work and clearing the bush and making a central Bible school at Brigham. It was a lot of hard work. And then near the end of 1960, we were due for go on furlough because we'd been there 5 years. But the mission had changed the policy as far as paying for fares going to and from Papua New Guinea. Before they paid the fares for missionaries, but because finance was short, they couldn't pay for fares. And they said to us, "Well, you've got to pay your own fare back home again." That was November 1960. So the mission policy was you're not allowed to publicise the fact that you needed money for a particular thing. And we were quite happy about that. We agreed with that. You've got to look to the Lord for supplying your finances. So we looked to the Lord, and by April of next year, enough finance had come in for our trip back home. And from then on, we sort of had no worries about finance at all. We're trusting the Lord. And going back to the start of 1960, there was a couple of examples which made us realise God does watch over. You know, in Matthew 28, he asks you to go and preach the gospel to all creatures, to everybody. And I like to sort of add a bit onto that he asks you to go, but he promises that he'll be faithful. He'll look after you and watch over you every day. At the time, in the beginning of 1960, we were living up at Mism, which is in the hill country. And being Christmas time, it's wet season, the roads are all muddy, rivers are up in flood, you can't get across them. And Ruth's starting to have trouble with her leg. She thought, well, maybe it's deep vein thrombosis. She should really get out and see a doctor. But there's no vehicle could go on the road when the rivers are all in flood. And then one morning was a knock at the door early in the morning. Well, nobody ever knocks at the door up there because when they come to visit you, they stand outside the door and cough. You've got to recognise their cough, and then, well, you can greet them and they'll come in. This morning, there was quite a definite knock at the door. We wondered, well, who could be knocking at the door? We went to the door. There's two Europeans at the door, looking rather wet and tired. And they'd been doing a survey over on the ridge across the valley from Missum. And it was being so wet and the house was leaking, they got all cold. And they came across and asking, well, can we come to your place for a couple of nights, have a hot shower and a dry bed for a couple of nights? We said, yes, certainly, no trouble at all. One of them was a medical assistant from a government station quite close, and the other was a doctor, an important doctor from Australia. And he looked at Ruth, he said, no, you haven't got DVT, deep vein thrombosis, it's something else. We couldn't get out to see a doctor, but God had to send a doctor all the way from Australia to see us. So God is faithful. A few months after that, Ruth started to go into labour. She was 6 weeks early. We had planned to go to a Brethren hospital to the west of us, which is quite good and reasonable price. But going into labour so early, we had to call out to the medical assistant over at Drakey Care. And the day before, a vehicle had gone across to Drakey Care, and it's the first vehicle we'd heard on the road for about 3 months because it was so wet and the river was in flood. So the medical assistant was able to use that vehicle to come down to the river halfway to our place, walk through the river, come up to Ruth, stay the night with us. Then we carried Ruth in an old deck chair down to the river and then into the government vehicle and up to the government station. And from there, she flew out in a Catholic mission plane to Wewak to the coast. And because the airstrip there was only about 290 metres long, a very, very small airstrip, it had a hill at one end to stop the planes, and the other end was a Catholic church, which was a bit an extension to the airstrip, but the Catholic church was right at the end of the extension, so no use to planes. So they took Ruth out to the coast at Wewak, but he couldn't take me because the airstrip being so short, the plane would have been too heavy. The next day he called in and picked me up and took me to Wewak, and I dashed out to the hospital not knowing what had happened. The day before, when Ruth got to the hospital, she went straight to the maternity ward to the theatre, and a stillborn baby was born. And the doctor was very sorry. He said, oh, there's nothing I can do. It had been dead for about 2 weeks. And after talking for a while, he was just about to give us some medicine to close things up and go. And Ruth said, oh, just wait a minute. I've felt movement since I've been here. So the doctor was puzzled. He couldn't understand why or what was happening. And a few minutes later, our son, Timothy, was born, which is a real miracle. The doctor stayed long enough for the birth. But we were a bit worried because Ruth had to stay in Wewak with a MAF family for about a month. And we were worried about all the expense of her accommodation there. When I flew back into Marpwick, I did what everybody does and went to the post office to see what mail was there. There's a letter there from the mission in Auckland saying that a gift had been sent up for us a month before, which was exactly the right amount to cover all our expenses in Wewak. So a month before we needed it, God answered prayer before we'd even prayed about the expenses. That happened quite often. While we were at Missum, we were learning the language because it's important to know and be able to speak the same language as the people you're going to help. And also there's a lot of sorcery in the area, a terrific lot. So we had to learn about sorcery, and because we couldn't tell you that God was able to overcome the devil and overcome these sorcery practices unless we knew and understand them. You can't say that God can help unless you know what their problems were. Learning the language, we sort of had two words very close together. Neem, like N-I-M for coconut, N-I-M for a knife, and N-E-M for a coconut. But we wondered, was there another vowel in between the I and the E? And we couldn't quite work it out. So we thought we'd ask the Wycliffe Bible translators to come and help us. They were in the Highlands, quite a distance away from us. And it'd be quite expensive to have a person fly a person down to give us help. And before we prayed about it, but before we rode up to SIL to ask them, if you have anybody down in our area, could they come and help us to save us the expense? But then a policeman came to the door, and he had a note from the government officer to the west of us asking, Brian, can you please help me? I've got 2 Wycliffe men here doing a survey for the government of all the languages in the area to determine where the boundaries are. But it's a long weekend coming up, and I want to go and play golf at Marprick. Do you think you could look after them for me while I go and play golf? So we said, certainly, we'd love to. The next day, we delivered them right to our door in a government vehicle. And we worked it out and to finish. Our head schoolboy was very good at languages, and he came up with another word, undit-nim, which is a bird. The nim's a particular type of bird, and the undit's a big name for bird. And the nim was exactly the vowel we were looking for. So we had neem for knife, nim for bird, and nem for coconut. So that was good. And then the government vehicle came and picked the man up and went back. And then the government sent over a note thanking us for looking after the man so that he can go and play golf. And in the note was a cheque from the government for all the expenses for the time we'd given hospitality to them. So we not only had help from the Wycliffe folk, we're paid for being helped, for getting the help. We were very conscious of God watching over us every day and providing for our needs, sometimes long before we knew we had a need. We're never much in danger there at all because the area had been opened up in the 1945 war, or 39-45. The Japanese came through there and the people learned to speak pidgin English, and the folk really appreciated us being there, and we felt quite safe. The only bit of fun we had one day, which is I found a bit more humorous than serious. One day in school, the children were rather agitated and kept on looking up the road to see up the track to the village. And I said, well, sit down, don't worry. Why are you looking up to the village? Well, Tengiai's coming, Tengiai's coming. I said, that's all right. Tengi was a fairly old man. I knew him quite well. I said, that's all right, sit down. So later on, Tengiai comes marching down the road with a great big long 2.5 metre spear and a big bush knife in one hand. And he goes up to our house, and Ruth comes to the door and talks to him. And then Ruth got a bit worried, so she sent the Metio, the houseboy, down and said, oh, you better come up. Tengiai doesn't look too good. So I went up to the house, and by that time Tengiai was around the back of the house. And I spoke to him. I knew enough of his language, and he didn't know pidgin English at all. But I could speak to him in his own language, and he's starting to calm down. He was quite good. And then all of a sudden, he lifted up his spear and a real look of anger on his face. And I looked behind me, and there was Metio, the houseboy. He'd come out of the house. He's peeping around the side of a tang stand to see what Tengiai was doing. So Tengiai saw him and he didn't like him, so he picked up his spear, picked up his knife and charged after Metio. And Metio took off and went down to the school where Ruth was. And then when all the school children saw Tengiai coming with a spear raised up, the whole class stood up, and at the end of the school was 2 windows about 600 millimetre wide. And the whole class, 60 children as one, just dived out of the windows, just like as a school of fish being chased by a shark or diving through the window. And the bush behind the school just all parted. And then Tengiai went down to the river then, and a neighbour was down the river, and he whacked his neighbour over the head with a knife. So Cass saw the neighbour was a big chap, so he just picked Tengiai up and threw him in the river. And then Tengiai picked up his knife with the bloodstains on it, rushed up to a government station, ran into a government officer's house, said, oh, I've killed a man. And then the government officer could see he was a bit crazy, so they tried to restrain him. But old Tengiai wouldn't be restrained. So some policemen had to get some chairs and just pin him to the wall with the chairs. But that was the only time sort of we came close to anybody running past us with a spear, but they weren't running after us. But school children, we found out afterwards, used to torment him in the village, and every now and again he'd lose his cool and chase the kids. Now, children were a lovely blessing, especially on the field too, because a baby would really, everybody would love a baby. When Ruth had her first one, he was a bit premature, so he was 6 weeks early. He was very small. So the village people called him Mick Kupwai, meaning small man. And our houseboy then met yours still. His mother was a very old lady, and one day she came up to the house to see where this little European baby was. So without asking any questions, she just walked straight to the house and just searched every room in the house till she found Timothy. And then she sort of bit her finger and danced around in amazement of such a little child. But the children were a good entrance into the village. The folk realised, well, you're normal, you're a normal family. When we got to 1970, we were teaching in the Bible school there. And what we found very good is going through the book of Romans, because Romans was really written for a non-Jewish church or people, and it really applied to the local people up there. The medical work was quite important work. It gave us openings into many people's hearts and lives. One of our schoolboys, Mumbe, he wasn't at school for a couple of weeks. The other children said, he's gone down to the bush to start a new garden with his parents. But after a couple of weeks, Mumbe turned up again, just not a shadow of his old self. He's looking really sick. His knee was covered with a lot of leaves and bits of banana leaf and wrapped up with string. I unwound everything, and it was just a putrid mass of rotting flesh. It had been at the top of a tree in the new garden, cutting all the branches up. He'd fallen and landed on one of the big flanges that come out from the base of a tree. And he couldn't move or couldn't do anything. He just had to sleep in the garden house for a couple of weeks. By the time he got to me, it was a terrific mess. I never smelled such a putrid smell. So we gave him some injections and bathed his knee time and time again for about a week, and she started to pick up. And since that time, he was a very close friend. He taught me his language. When I went to visit other villages, he was the first one to come and carry a pack to go to other places. He was one of the first to become a Christian at Missum. And then later on, he went as a evangelist up on the coast to a new place and started the church up there. Then he went over to New Britain and helped in the work there. Then he came down to the Bible school at Brigham and taught in the Bible school. And while I was at Bible school, the village people wanted to appoint him as a village magistrate. But he said, no, I want to do God's work. The magistrate would have been quite well paying, but he put God's work first. So he went on for years and years. Yeah, I felt God had called me to help the people in New Guinea, to bring the gospel to them. And after coming home, we came home in 1971. And from then on, I kept in contact with the different missionaries that had been up there. I sent out a newsletter every month or so telling of what's happening up there. And then in 2006, I went back to visit them and do some work up there. And at the time, Gillian, who was the pastor at the time, he was concerned about the education of the children. Of course, after we'd left and the missionary who had followed us left, there was no school for them at all. So in 2006, he gave a piece of his land below his village to start a school. So they started the school, just a bush material buildings, bush material desks and logs and things. So then sending out emails to the ex-missionaries up there, we got together and bought a chainsaw for him, and he was able to saw up timber with a chainsaw just by putting a line down the log and sawing it freehand. And then we helped him buy I think they're called the Canadian saws, like a framework to hold the chainsaw so they can cut off slabs. And since then, he's built a marvellous schools, even a 2-storied building with 4 classrooms. And it's all done without outside finance from the government at all. The government provided for teachers. And the last year, with grade 8, they had 32 students in grade 8, and 28 of them passed their exam and got the right to go into high school. So he's done a marvellous work. And being able to send emails every month or so to the different missionaries has helped us keep in touch with that work. And then one of the missionaries has sent up some school books. And Gillian, in 2021, he wrote down saying that the school books have all been eaten by white ants because it's just in a bush building. So I sent out news that we needed to get school books for him. So he got a big crate full of school books to send up. And also at that time, Gillian sent word down, he's got a school teacher there that is trained as a carpenter teacher. So we got together a whole lot of carpentering tools and sent up a big crate of carpentering tools for them to have some decent tools to work with. So having contact with Gillian back at Missum, we were able to keep in touch with the village there, and every week he talks to me on the phone. 2015, Ruth's dementia was getting worse. She couldn't remember anything at all about New Guinea. Sometimes she wouldn't recognise me, but if I had Bella with me, she'd recognise Bella because Bella was her dog. And then one day, quite out of the blue, she said, "How are Mumba and Naomi?" Because Mumba and Naomi were living with us virtually for about 10 years. And then a fortnight afterwards, when I came back from visiting her, there was a phone call from New Guinea telling us that Mumba had died. And I asked Gillian, well, had he been sick for a long time or was it sudden? He said, oh, about a fortnight ago, he suddenly got sick and now he's died. So that was amazing. When God told Ruth that our friend was sick before anybody knew at all. But I'd always give a call. As soon as I arrive, I give a New Guinea call. I don't know if you had them in the lowlands down the Gulf. Up there they had a yodel. Ooh, ooh, ooh. And everybody had a name. And so as soon as I get to see Ruth, I'll call out her name. Ooh, ooh, ooh. That sort of makes it think about me. She recognises me by my call. In mission work, it's not just the Bible teaching which is central, but people of all different skills are needed for bookkeeping, language learning, printing, building, airstrips, aeroplanes. There's a vast degree of people that are needed. One of the main lessons I've learned is that God is faithful. If God calls you to a job, he will be with you every day you are there. And he'll watch over you and provide for you. He is faithful.